Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our guest speaker, President and CEO of MBBI, Prabha Sankaranarayan.
So this is the world that occupies me for a large part of my time. That is, in addition to the other kinds of things I might engage in. And I say welcome to this world because it is the world in which we all live. And I want to focus my presentation today on something that Rotarians, people of action, can do something about. And I'm focusing on beyond binaries because what we as peacemakers, peace builders can do is amplify nuance and complexity. In a world where everything is reduced to binaries, everything is reduced to the lowest common denominator, to what might get the most eyeballs for a television station. We spend very little time focusing on complexity and nuance, and that is what we need to do if we are to move out of this era of simplifying everything in this way. So my name is Prabha Sankaranarayan, and I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I am an immigrant from India, a mother, a trauma survivor, and I could go on about the multiple aspects of my identity. And I do that again to underscore that what we all bring and the world in which we live in is beyond binaries and needs to be looked at from more perspectives than one. To what extent are we hardwired for conflict? And I like looking at all of you, which is what makes it very hard because I'm not using multiple screens. I chose to focus on this topic both from a global perspective. You heard me describe some of the statistics globally, and I want to narrow it down to what is both going on both globally and in the United States. And I say the United States partly because I am really concerned, as are all of you, that democracy is at risk. And I don't mean to be dramatic. Those of you who study international politics, international relations, the events around the world are trending in a certain direction. And it's important for us to pay attention. Globally, the trends I will mention, the first is the rise of populism and populist movements. That's not confined to one country. We're seeing that around the world. The second is the increased adherence of political parties to authoritarian norms. This was not always true. What we are seeing is an increase of parties making authoritarianism, normalizing it. You know, I can ask you for examples of countries you might see both of the first two trends. I look at India, I look at Hungary, I look at Brazil. You could probably add to this list, and feel free to do so in the chat as you look at countries in which we can see these two trends. The third one is the generational decline in the trust of national and multinational institutions. This has not happened suddenly either. For a variety of reasons, there has been a growing decline in trust in institutions. The fourth is one that needs to be mentioned. You started the meeting with a mention of it, which is COVID as a shock to the system. It's a somewhat unique social disruption, and there are countries that are now moving to considering it an endemic, which changes your mitigation measures than a pandemic. So these four are global trends. Let me focus on the US ones. The high levels of toxic polarization. What we are seeing now is that upward trend over the last 50 years of Americans increasingly reluctant to engage across party lines. One of the parties' documented deviation towards more authoritarian norms, the changing demographics that portend a non-white majority, the largest mobilization for racial justice since the civil rights movement. And the last one in the United States is reduced social identity complexity. These are the global trends. And when I say these are relevant for us, my concern is that there is an important need to pay attention to what is going on in the United States, because the way democracy goes here, so goes democracy around the world. And that is an important factor for us to keep in mind. Let me tell you what's on my bookshelf these days, and I will share why. They are by movement leaders, Kingian nonviolence trainers like Kazu Haga. I highly recommend his amazing book on movements. Bruce Perry, who I have been following for the last 35 years. My first career was as a trauma specialist. I work with children and families at designing interventions to address the impact of trauma on children, families, and communities. And I continue to do that. And Bruce Perry has been doing amazing work, research, and program design in that area. If you haven't read Amanda Ripley's book, she's a New York Times journalist who translates concepts about conflict using her power as a storyteller. She talks about what high conflict means, why we get trapped in the conflicts we do, and how we get out of them. This book by Bertram Levine and Grant Lum is about peacemakers in the United States. This is about the Department of Justice's Center, CRS, and the community mediation centers, the community relations services, and its origins in the civil rights movement. And the last one is the one that scares me the most. Cynthia Miller Idris is an author and academic at American University. And this book, I spent this morning speaking with a young man named Jesse Morton, who was one of the most effective recruiters for ISIS between 2003 and 2013. A young man who grew up in my home state of Pennsylvania, experienced significant abuse, found an identity and a cause within ISIS when he converted to Islam, became extraordinarily capable of mastering techniques for recruitment, served time, worked with the CIA, and now leads an organization called Parallel Networks, which is focused on preventing the radicalization. So why do I say Hate in the Homeland is an important book? This is about the divisiveness that has become normalized in the United States. Cynthia, Dr. Miller, actually, Miller Idris, talks about how she felt such an urgent need a year and a half ago to write about this from the perspective, in a perspective that was easily readable, was because she saw the normalization of white supremacist groups, Aryan Nation groups in this country, and the infiltration in every aspect. And by that, I mean from television shows to mixed martial arts groups for children, to food shows, to clothing and apparel. What we are finding is that the radicalization of people in the United States has gone down. It used to be about 6.5 months, is what Jesse Morton says. Today, it has dropped to 3.5 months from exposure to action. I share these with you because I feel a very strong sense of urgency about the need for all of us in this country to play a role in addressing this. This is not about anything but divisiveness. And I think it's really important that, and I don't know anyone besides Rotary International that is in every club, that has a club in countries across the world. The power, I call it a peace force, the power of Rotarians to engage, the power of Rotarians as leaders in communities, for me, places an extraordinary responsibility on our shoulders to engage in our communities in order to protect what I think needs protection. Let me share a little bit about this amazing perspective that I think is important, why it is important for us to pay attention to the neurobiology of conflict. Why do conflicts erupt so easily? Why are some people more open to it than others? Why are so many people willing to kill and be killed for a cause? Why are conversations about conflicts so difficult? One of the things that we saw was that in both Brexit and the Trump campaigns, leaders used their rhetoric not to appeal rationally to followers' interests, but to appeal emotionally to their instinctual and emotional predispositions. While the debate was not dominated by sober analysis and evidence-based reason, it was not dominated by that, but by hysteria, hatred, savage emotions, and the sinister monster of exclusionary ethnic nationalism. I mention this because the neuroscience and the biosciences study how the biology of the brain and the body affects how we feel, think, and behave. And now it is being used in neuromarketing, neuroeconomics, neurolaw, neurotheology, and we need to use it in peace building. And we have begun to do that over the last 20 years using the advanced technology of functional MRIs, begun to look at whether we are hardwired differently. And the research informs what we can do. And while all of this is lovely and complicated, what is also true is what we can do about it goes back to the basics. When I look at what we can do, I'm compelled to look at how we take action that is focused in our communities to shift our perspectives. As we watch the tragedy unfolding in Afghanistan, in Haiti, in the parts of the world where people are exposed to violent conflict, I can't help thinking, what is it that divides us? What do we need to know and understand in order to prevent that cycle that you see on the right that continues without interruption in some places? What are the tools we have to interrupt those cycles? I'm going to skip very quickly to how we engage. I don't think, as Mandela said, there is much we can do if we cannot be honest with ourselves. And part of that means developing the capacity to listen, to reflect, to respond, and to ask questions, to bring back our capacity for asking questions of genuine curiosity. And so when you ask, what do hormones and neurotransmitters have to do with violence, conflict, and resolution? A lot. And I think it's our responsibility to understand. I don't think it's enough for any one of us anymore to read in only one area of practice. I think it's extraordinarily important for us to understand the complexity with which neurobiology is being used to increase divisiveness. And so what we do at Mediators Beyond Borders with IEP and with Rotary International is build those skills at the very basic level. And what you can do is join in this effort as Jim Palmquist has done. And I will say, who was it? Was it Maria May who was describing his months of commitment? It was actually years, ladies and gentlemen, that Jim stayed committed to one cause. And I want to end my presentation and open up for questions with a story from one of the participants in West Africa who is working in the conflict area in Cameroon. What your club, what your districts are supporting are women in countries around the world engaging in this process of moving beyond binaries to complexity and nuance, of engaging community members, of engaging the media and youth in beginning to have conversations that address what they share and creating common ground instead of furthering divisiveness. So thank you for your support for our work, and thank you for allowing me to share a few thoughts today.
Thank you for being here. Very insightful, very helpful. How can the best practices that you've realized or developed through Mediators Beyond Borders address some of the hot spots and conflict zones? You named some of those, but even on the African continent, there are several dozen. How can mediators without Beyond Borders be able to address some of these in very practical ways that possibly we can resolve them and not just have them lessen or continue? And thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Let me address it in three ways. One, we believe in the principle that people at the heart of the conflict need to be a part of its solution. Where that leads us is to South Africa, where the Rotary district in Southern Africa, for their centenary year, which you have long passed, I noticed, decided to train 100 community mediators. And they recruited people who were 70% non-Rotarians, 30% Rotarians, and they represented a demographic very different from the Rotary clubs in those districts until that time. So people at the heart of the conflict as a part of the solutions, Rotarians can support that by building the capacity of community peace builders. So what the Southern African district did was train 100 people. We are in the middle of that. And guess what happened? You all saw it. You don't have to guess. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be flip. You saw the violence break out in South Africa. What that gives us an opportunity to do is equip the community members to engage immediately. I reached out to many of my colleagues on the continent. Immediately, a women's network organized a national dialogue platform. They gathered about 300 people to hear what was happening at the ground, like a mapping process. Rotarians could participate in those kinds of activities because you bring the unique perspectives as community leaders. So engaging in communities where you have built capacity can be extraordinarily effective. The second is you can directly support back channel activities. 2 years ago, Ravindran presented at our conference, and we used that opportunity to have a consultation about Cameroon, for example. And I'm getting to your question of what are the best practices, right? You can support actors who have the skills to intervene directly. This is peace building at its best. So during the time that Ravindran was there, past president, and Nobel laureate Jose Ramos Horta, negotiator for the Balkans, Edita Tahir, former fighter for the Dom, Shadia Marhaban, we had an opportunity with a youth leader from Cameroon who said, help us. And Ian Lancaster, who some of you may know, who is in the Rotary Club in outside Toronto, literally on a napkin mapped out the Rotary clubs and districts in that country and said, we can reach out to these leaders if we need to do some back channel work. So what's happened is that over the last year, we have built relationships with the leaders of the separatist movement and are building their capacity to negotiate effectively so that they can participate in the peace process. I think Rotarians can support those kinds of activities. I will say that is not public work. That is work that happens behind the scenes that still needs support, right? Bringing those groups together, bringing them together with negotiators so that they can train themselves in negotiating more effectively, in building cohesion amongst their different groups, so that they can come to the peace table as more effective partners. The third, I think, is for Rotarians themselves to model holding difficult conversations. What we have found is that some of the topics that we do not touch not because they are political, it's because we often don't have the skills to have these conversations. So a global grant that Dave Hamilton in British Columbia implemented was extraordinary. It was with Niska Nation. For the first time, the First Nations invited us to participate and build the capacity of their community. And there were about 50 or 60 youth and Rotarians who were trained as peace facilitators. Shortly after that, they discovered the Kamloops burial grounds of the children in that boarding school. This is something that's unfolding across Canada and the United States. What they were able to do then is have the facilitators within their communities to have the kinds of healing dialogues that are now necessary for us to address the harm that has been done and to build a future together. Rotarians are doing that with First Nations in British Columbia. So I would say those are three ways. Not a very short answer, but you all do too much amazing work for my answers to be short.
Here last week we had none other than Peter Kyle, who summarized for us, gave us a retrospective on the incredible history of Rotary, going back to World War I, and then even being present at the time of the founding of the United Nations. But our tradition of peace building and what that is, and you've illustrated that more clearly. We have as our club theme this year, Rotarians engaging youth for peace in the environment. So peace is a big thing, and we're creating a peace building working group within our International Service Committee. So we're focusing on that. You've been very instructive, and I had one question for you. How is peacefulness measured in a given country? What are the factors that go into its measurement?
I would encourage you all to look at the 7 areas in IEP's actually peace index. So while they measure the decline of peace, positive peace, and the 7 pillars of positive peace have to do with factors such as the distribution of resources, good relations, and I can't rattle off all 7 of them, but let me see if I can find that very quickly.
I think it's economicsandpeace.org. It has
Right.
all that information that you're looking for, Bill.
Okay, thank you. All right,
And,
so
and
I'll
that's
look there.
really, really very helpful. I really think it's extremely, strategic that this partnership with IEP allows us to look at how it's measured.
Sure.
And what we're talking about is positive peace. So we're not just talking
Right.
about militarization, but what are the indicators that demonstrate the growth of peace?
Got it. And I was fascinated by what you talked about, building capacity in communities. So the communities are ready to deal with conflict issues.
Exactly.
internally. Yeah. Okay.
As prevention and as a part of building resilience. Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you very much for your remarks today. And we have run out of time for Q&A, but we have a tradition of making a commitment to plant a tree in the honor of each of our speakers. We have a partnership with the National Park Service. We do it. We plant cherry blossom trees, replacements around the tidal basin, and retree the downtown parks. So we'll actually be able to tell you where your tree is located.